Hey tech heads, welcome to Mobile Quickie. I'm Dennis here in my own backyard. Today's video is all about getting started with the data API for Aurora Serverless Databases. We're going to go through quickly 3 ways to provision those resources through the RDS console, through a CloudFormation template, and using the AWS CLI or SDK. Then once we get those resources configured, we're going to connect to those resources with 4 ways using the Lambda function, the query editor from RDS, AWS AppSync, and again, the AWS CLI or the SDK. I can't wait to show you guys. Let's get started. Okay, in this section, we're going to use the RDS console to provision the Aurora Serverless cluster with data API. So let's get started. First, log into the RDS console in the US East for now, and click on Create Database. And that'll pull up the options. We're going to choose Amazon Aurora, upper left, and then MySQL 5.6 compatible. Notice that's for serverless, and hit next, next, and then select serverless on this third option. Give it a cluster name. This is not the database name. I want to just call it My Serverless Cluster. And then it's going to ask for a master username and a master password. So provide that. I'm going to paste mine in here and hit next. And then leave everything else default, VPC, creation, everything. I unchecked enable protection and create database just for now. You can keep that checked if you wanted to protect it. Now click on the cluster, and then it'll be about 1 minute before it's created. So keep an eye on that info. It'll say creating for about a minute. I'm going to run through this really fast. It should fast forward. And then once it's ready, we'll be able to click on that and enable the data API here in a second. So we'll let that run. We're going to go to databases. Again, see it's available. We'll hit modify for this database or this cluster. And then let's scroll down to the network and security section. This is really important. The data API. Select data API right there. And then select continue. And now we want to apply it. So then we're going to select apply immediately instead of waiting for the schedule maintenance window and say modify cluster. And that's it. We just created a new cluster and enabled the data API. Let's move on. Okay, in this section, we're going to use CloudFormation to provision a new RDS Aurora Serverless with data API enabled. It'll also create a Lambda function so that we could use that later to connect into that RDS instance. Let's get started. So in the repo, I put in the link below, so click on that. And then in here, there's instructions to actually launch the stack. So when you're in the repo, click Launch Stack. It'll take us to a CloudFormation, hit next, and then you could change the stack name if you like, but put in a database name. Put in Marketplace if you want, because that's what we'll use for later, and then your own master username and password. And then we'll hit next, and then scroll down and leave all the defaults, hit next, and then make sure you check I acknowledge the IAM rule resource will be created, hit create, and then we'll wait for that to be created in just about a minute or two. So once we have that selected, I'll look down, we'll have outputs in there, and we have a secret ARN, a database name, and the cluster ARN for us. And so we'll use that, and it's already placed in there as constants for our Lambda function. So that's it for creating it. Now we're going to go into the database, and we're going to enable the data API, which is really important so we can connect to it with these different resources. Hit modify, and then scroll down to the network and security section. We're going to select Data API, and that's it, leave everything else default, and then scroll down and hit Continue. And then make sure you hit Apply immediately so it applies, it doesn't wait for this maintenance window, and hit Modify Cluster, and that's it. We've created a new cluster. We've created a Lambda function that we'll connect to later, and now we're going to run through the query editor. In this section, we're going to use the AWS CLI. This is the third option to create an Aurora Serverless Database. So in the console, you'll see here I have no instances running. And so we'll go back to a snippet of code that I have here. And it has create DB cluster. We're going to give it a name, give it a master user, a master password. The engine is Aurora, and then serverless. Now I'm going to take away this HTTP data point because we're in beta and that's not available yet. So copy that out, and then we'll paste it into a terminal, and this will automatically create a new Aurora Serverless cluster. Now, we don't have the data API enabled yet, but once this is created, we're going to go into the RDS console here and then refresh it. We'll wait just probably a minute or two, and once that status says ready, we're going to modify this and enable the data API. So now that it's ready, select it, and then hit modify in the upper right, and then scroll down to network and security and select data API. This is what we want to enable, the data API, so we can call it from the CLI, from Lambda functions, from AppSync, whatever it might be. Hit select apply immediately so we can apply this change and start using it, and modify cluster. And that's it. Now we've done the 3 ways to build out a CloudFormation. We use the CLI and we use the RDS console to build an Aurora Serverless with data API enabled. Now let's talk about the 4 ways that we can connect into this serverless Aurora database. We're going to talk about using a CLI or the SDK. We're going to use Lambda, AppSync, and the new query editor through the RDS console. Let's get started. In this section, we're going to use the query editor to connect to our Aurora Serverless Data API database. This is one of the great things about using the data API. We could use this right from the console, connect to the database, do CRUD operations all day long, check it out, and move on. So let's take a look. So log into the RDS console and select your database or the cluster. And then from here, on the left side, do query editor, and then select your instance. This is the cluster instance. And then put in your credentials. These are the master user and the master password that you're going to use to connect to that database. And then again, earlier we created a marketplace database with a formation. Click connect. We'll clear it. And then I got a snippet of code that lets us create a couple tables. So let's say use marketplace, and I'm going to paste in these 2 create tables for MySQL. And I'm going to paste it into this query editor, and we'll run it, see what that looks like. So again, we're connected to that cluster. Now we're using that marketplace database, and you'll see the status, boom, created there. And now we've created both tables. So I'm going to clear it and now do just regular select statement, select star from customers. We have no data in there, so we won't see anything, but at least you'll be able to see what that looks like. Hit run, and empty. So we have ID, name, and phone, and email are empty. So that's it for the Aurora Serverless Data API using the console to do the data query. And let's move on to the next piece. Okay, now we're going to use the AWS CLI to connect into our serverless database with the data API enabled. So we're going to just take a look here in the snippet of code that I have. We're going to use the RDS-data API that's available through the global CLI. And then earlier we created the CloudFormation template, which provided the ARNs for us to put in the CLI. So we need the cluster ARN and the secret ARN. And I've already pasted it in there. So those are the storing of the master and the password in the secret store, and then the cluster instance is there. And then we use our profile, which is mine is a burner, for an AWS CLI profile. And then we create it, spits back the information there, and now we have a connection and made a connection to that database through just the CLI. Okay, on to the next one. Okay, in this section we're going to use an AWS Lambda function to connect into our Aurora Serverless database with the data API enabled. So earlier we did the CloudFormation template that built out this Lambda function with some hard-coded constants in there so we can actually pull in and connect to our database. So let me show you what that looks like. So in the Lambda console here, scroll down, we have the environment variables that were created through that CloudFormation template, which is the cluster ID, again, store ARN for the password. And then, as you know, we went back to the stack. That's where the information came from, and we spit it back in there. And then I created a little script to test this out. So it's going to use these values in there. And then I use this code that was from Jeremy Daly, his blog. So check that out a little later if you want. And I just use this code, and then it's using those environment variables to connect into that data source. So now we'll collect in to go to test event and simple SQL statement, select star from customers, and run it. And we should see a result come back immediately with an empty because we haven't actually populated that customers table. And that's it. So it's really simple to connect into your serverless database with Lambda function using that simple code using the new API. Okay, this is the last section, but the best one. So we're using AWS AppSync to connect into our Aurora Serverless database with the data API enabled. So AppSync supports it natively, and we're able to actually create a schema based off of data we put into the database. And I'll show you a little bit how that works, and then we'll go into the console to manipulate it. So start out with just any basic web app or mobile app from the console. And first thing you're going to do is amplify init. And choose a project name. A lot of these are just default. Your environment, I call it dev, and your favorite editor. JavaScript, this is a React app. And then so I'm going to just choose through the defaults just for demonstration purposes. Choose my profile. And then I'll initialize everything, get it ready. And then I'm going to go amplify, add API. And we're going to choose the GraphQL API versus the rest. We're going to choose GraphQL, give it an API name, and use API key as the permissions for now. And say nope. And then no, I don't need to be guided through, and enter through there. Now the last piece, this is the new one. We're going to use the API add GraphQL data source, which takes the data store. We're going to select the database and take all the data in that table or any of the tables and create a schema for us. And then we're going to go to the AppSync console and start manipulating some of that data. Thanks for watching, and if you like what I'm doing, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to be notified when we drop a new mobile quickie.